What would make a mother push her own child into a river to save him? This is Moses, a prince who discovered his whole life was a lie, a man who ran, a shepherd who spent 40 years believing he was nobody. You are not one of us, you never were. That voice haunted him for 80 years. But what if the thing that disqualifies you is exactly why God chose you? You will watch a mother let go of everything she loves. You will see two brothers become enemies, and you will witness an 80-year-old man finally hear the one word he waited his whole life for, mama. Stay until the end, because this story will teach you that your weakness is not a wall, it is a door. If you have ever felt lost, broken, or not enough, this story is for you. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and comment the word chosen if you believe God can use broken people, because that means the world to us. Now let us begin. The torches moved closer, and Jochebed could hear the soldiers laughing, kicking down doors, dragging babies from the arms of their mothers. She had minutes, maybe less. She looked at her son, 3 months old, eyes like dark honey. He did not cry. He just watched her, trusting her completely. She held him to her chest one last time, and she breathed him in, the warm scent of his skin, the weight of him in her arms, everything she was about to lose. She whispered, "I am saving you by letting you go. Forgive me, please forgive me." The basket was ready, for she had made it with her own hands, sealing every gap, praying over every thread. A tiny ark for a tiny life. She lowered him inside, and his fingers wrapped around hers. She could not let go, and her hands would not move. Miriam, only 9 years old, pulled at the robe of her mother, her voice shaking but firm. "Mama, they are coming. You have to let go now." And the fingers of Jochebed opened. The basket slid into the river, and the current caught it and pulled it away, toward the place where Egyptians bathed, toward the enemy, toward the only chance he had. She collapsed into the reeds, and she bit down on her own arm to stop the scream tearing through her chest. Miriam held her, a child comforting a mother, both watching the basket grow smaller and smaller. And Jochebed knew she would never hold her son the same way again. The basket drifted into the royal gardens. A hand reached down and lifted the crying baby from the reeds. She was the daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter of the same Pharaoh who had ordered every Hebrew boy thrown into the Nile. But when she looked at this child, she did not see a Hebrew, she saw a son. "I will call him Moses, drawn from the water, and he will be mine." Pharaoh allowed it, for what harm could one baby do? Word spread through the slave quarters that a Hebrew woman was needed to nurse the child. Jochebed came to the palace with her head bowed, and her heart slamming against her ribs. She held her own son again, but now as a servant. She fed him and she rocked him to sleep. And late at night, when the palace fell silent, she would carry him to the servants' quarters, and she would listen for footsteps. Then she would sing, "Sleep, little one, the night is long. The river took you, but love stays strong. You are my heart, though you wear their name. Sleep, my son. You are loved all the same." It was the only truth she could give him without losing him forever. The boy grew, and he learned to walk on marble floors and to speak like royalty. And when he was old enough, he reached for the princess and said his first word, "Mother." The smile of Jochebed stayed frozen on her face, and her fingernails pressed into her palms until small red crescents appeared. She bowed and stepped backward into the shadows where servants belong. The boy became a young man, dressed in gold and silk, and he learned to read and he learned to fight. And he found a brother, Ramesses, the prince who would one day rule Egypt. They raced chariots through Memphis, laughing, shoving, inseparable, two boys who believed the world belonged to them. "We will rule Egypt together, and you will be my right hand forever." Moses believed him, for he had no reason not to. He was a prince of Egypt, and he had everything. But some nights he heard a woman singing in the servants' quarters, a Hebrew melody, the same one over and over. He never saw who sang it, and he never thought to ask. But every time he heard it, something in his chest ached, a hollow space he could not name, and he did not know why. Moses was a man now, tall and strong, dressed in fine linen with gold on his wrists. He had never known hunger, he had never felt a whip, and he had never questioned who he was. Until the afternoon, he wandered beyond the palace walls. The construction site stretched across the sand, where thousands of slaves hauled stones under a white sun. Moses had seen this before, but he had never truly looked, and today he looked. An Egyptian guard stood over a Hebrew slave, an old man who had collapsed beneath his load. The whip rose and fell, and the old man curled into himself, too exhausted to scream anymore, whispering, "Please, I cannot." Something cracked open inside Moses, and he was running before he understood why. His hands, soft hands, clean hands, hands that had never worked, grabbed the guard and threw him backward. The head of the guard struck stone. Moses stood over the body, and the eyes of the man were open, but saw nothing. Moses looked at his own hands, golden rings, polished nails now red, and he could not breathe. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Then movement in the shadows, for a younger Hebrew had been watching. Moses turned toward him, desperate for something, understanding, forgiveness, anything. But the face of the man held neither. "You wear their gold, and you eat their food, and one dead guard does not make you our brother. You are not one of us, you never were." The words landed like stones in the chest of Moses. He looked at the body, he looked at his hands, and he looked toward the palace gleaming white in the distance. He could not go back, but he had nowhere else to go, so he ran. Moses walked until his sandals fell apart. Days passed, maybe weeks, and the desert stripped everything from him, his strength, his title, his name. The Prince of Egypt dissolved into sand and silence. He collapsed at a well in Midian, lips cracked, skin peeling, and he waited to die, for it seemed easier than remembering. The sound of laughter pulled him back, and he opened his eyes. Shepherd girls stood at the well trying to water their flock, and a group of men shoved them aside, kicking over their jars, blocking them from the water. Moses closed his eyes again, for it was not his fight. He was no one now, and no one helps anyone. But his legs pushed him upright, and his hands shoved the men back. He stood between the girls and the shepherds, swaying on his feet but unwilling to move, and something in his eyes made the men leave without a word. Then his legs gave out. A young woman knelt beside him and poured water over his cracked lips, saying, "You can barely stand, yet you fight for strangers. You are either very brave or running from something." Her father took him in out of gratitude and gave him sheep to tend, and gave him a staff, simple wood worn smooth by other hands, the tool of a nobody. Zipporah became his wife, and a son was born. Moses held the baby against his chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat, and whispered, "You will always know who you are. I will make sure of it." The words caught in his throat, a promise and a wound in the same breath. 40 years passed, and Moses grew weathered and gray. He never looked east toward Egypt, and he never spoke of marble floors or of blood on clean hands. But at night he still heard the voice, "You are not one of us, you never were." He had almost convinced himself he had forgotten, almost. If this story is gripping you, take 1 second to subscribe so the next one finds you, and share this with someone who has spent years believing they are disqualified. Because what happens on this mountain will change everything. One day a lamb wandered away from the flock, and Moses followed it up the mountain, muttering under his breath. 80 years old and still chasing sheep, for this was his life now, and this was all he would ever be. Then he saw the light. A bush burned on the rocks above, but the leaves did not blacken, and the branches did not curl. The fire danced without consuming, impossible alive. Moses stepped closer, and the air grew thick, and the ground hummed beneath his sandals like something ancient was waking. "Moses, take off your sandals. You are standing on holy ground. I have seen my people suffering in Egypt. I have heard their cries, and I am sending you to bring them out." Moses fell to his knees, and his hands flew up to cover his face, the same hands that had once been covered in blood. "The last time I tried to help someone, a man stopped breathing and I ran, and I have been running for 40 years. My tongue stumbles and my hands have done things. Please send someone else, anyone else." He could not look at the fire, and he could not look at anything. The flames blazed brighter, but when the voice came again, it was gentler, like a father speaking to a son who had forgotten his own name. "I knew you in the basket, Moses, and I knew you in the palace, and I knew you in the desert when you thought you were alone. You have never been lost. You have always been mine. Now go." Moses wept, 40 years of shame cracking open. The lie he had carried since that day in the sand, "You are not one of us, you never were," began to crumble. He rose on unsteady legs, and his staff felt different now, charged, ready. Egypt waited on the horizon, the place he had sworn never to return. But God had called him by name, and that changed everything. Moses stood before the palace gates. 40 years ago, he had run through them with blood on his hands. And now he returned with nothing but a wooden staff and a message that could burn the world down. The throne room was vast and cold, gold everywhere, incense thick in the air. And there, on a throne of gold, sat Ramesses. He was not the laughing boy from the chariot races, for his face had hardened into stone, with lines carved where laughter used to live. A golden serpent crowned his head, and he did not rise. 40 years, not one word, not one message, and now you return for slaves. Moses stepped forward, and he spoke of the fire on the mountain, the voice, and the God who had sent him to set his people free. Then Ramesses descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate, and he stopped close enough to whisper, "Your people, I was your people, I called you brother, and I would have given you half my kingdom, and you chose them over me." His voice cracked on the word brother, and for one breath his eyes shone wet. The boy Moses remembered still alive somewhere beneath the stone. Then his jaw tightened, and the wetness vanished, and only Pharaoh remained. Moses reached for his arm, the old gesture from their boyhood, and Ramesses pulled away as if the touch were fire. "The boy I loved died the night you ran, and you killed him, and the answer of Pharaoh is no." Moses walked toward the doors, and they slammed behind him like a tomb sealing shut. He did not look back, but if he had, he might have seen Ramesses gripping the arms of his throne until his knuckles turned white. And Moses would never see his brother again, only his enemy. Moses raised his staff over the Nile, and the water shuddered, then turned to blood, and it had begun. Frogs swarmed from the rivers into beds, into ovens, into the houses of the sleeping. Gnats rose from the dust like living clouds, and flies blackened the sky. Livestock collapsed in the fields, and boils split open on the skin of rich and poor alike. Hail fell like fists from heaven, and locusts devoured what the hail had spared. Egypt was unraveling, and Moses watched it happen. He walked through Memphis after the hail, and an Egyptian mother knelt in the street, cradling a dead goat, the only milk her family had. She looked up at Moses with eyes that did not understand, and he wanted to explain. He wanted to apologize, and he kept walking. And he thought, "How much more, Lord? How much more until it is enough?" But Ramesses would not bend, and each plague hardened him further. His advisors begged him to release the Hebrews, and he refused, for his pride was louder than the screams of his people. Then came the darkness, not night, something deeper, a blackness that pressed against the skin like wet cloth. For 3 days no one moved and no one spoke. On the third night, Ramesses sent for him. No throne room, no guards, just a small chamber and 2 men who could not see the face of the other. "How much more, Moses? How much more until you have had your revenge?" This was never revenge, and I wish you could believe that. "Make it stop, please." Silence, and then the voice of Ramesses again, cracked, stripped bare. And for one breath Moses heard his brother, the real one, still buried under all that pride. But when light returned, the heart of Pharaoh was stone again, and he told Moses to leave, and he said that the next time they met, one of them would die. Moses walked into the sunlight, and he knew what was coming next, for God had told him, and he fell to his knees in the sand and begged for another way. Moses gathered the elders and told them what God had said, the final plague, the one that would break Pharaoh. Every firstborn son in Egypt would die before morning. The elders stared, and some nodded slowly, and some wept, and Moses stood hollow, the words echoing in his skull like stones dropping into a well. That night he walked into the desert alone, past the tents, past the fires, past the sound of families preparing for a night they did not yet understand. He climbed a ridge until he could not hear human voices anymore, and then he screamed. The river turned to blood, the livestock fell. The sky went black, but this is something else. "Children, you are asking me to stand by while children stop breathing in their beds." He grabbed his staff and hurled it against the rocks, and it clattered and bounced and lay still in the dust. "Is this who you are? Is this who you are making me?" No answer, only the wind returning cold against his wet face. He fell forward, fingers clawing into the dirt, and his shoulders heaved. 40 years of hiding, 80 years of questions, and now this impossible crushing weight. He stayed there a long time, and the stars wheeled overhead, and his sobs became silence, and his silence became stillness. When he finally lifted his head, nothing had changed. God had not answered, and the command had not been withdrawn. Moses crawled to where his staff lay in the dust, and the wood was cracked where it had struck the rocks, and he picked it up anyway. He rose on unsteady legs, wiped the dirt from his face, and began the walk back toward the fires, for there was no other way, and he would carry this alone. The sun set red over Egypt, and the Hebrews painted their door frames with the blood of the lamb, still wet, catching the last light like dark jewels. They gathered their families inside, and they packed everything they owned, and then they waited. Moses sat with his family in a borrowed house, and his grandson crawled into his lap and tugged at his beard, asking, "What is happening tonight, grandfather?" Moses pulled the boy close, feeling the small heartbeat against his chest, and said, "Stay inside, and whatever you hear, do not open the door and do not look." The hours crawled and the oil lamps flickered, and somewhere in the distance a dog began to howl, then another, then nothing. Then it came, not thunder, not wind, just a sound rising over Egypt, the wail of mothers discovering their children cold in their beds. One voice, then 10, then 10,000, bleeding into a single cry that had no end. Moses closed his eyes, and tears ran down his face and into his beard. He wept for the Hebrew slaves who had suffered 400 years, and he wept for the Egyptian children who had done nothing wrong, and he wept for the boy Ramesses used to be. Dawn came gray and silent, and Egypt was a tomb wrapped in mist. A messenger arrived. Pharaoh wanted Moses now. The throne room was empty. No guards, no advisors, just Ramesses sitting on the steps below his throne, holding his son. The boy was limp, and Ramesses rocked him slowly back and forth, the way a father rocks a baby to sleep. But this child would never wake. He did not look up when Moses entered, and he said, "Take your people, take your God, and leave my land." His voice was hollow, a broken instrument, and Moses could not move, for he had seen Ramesses proud, angry, hard as stone, but never this, a man emptied of everything except grief. Ramesses lifted his eyes, red and dry beyond tears, and said, "I hope this haunts you, every night, every dream, until the day you die." Moses turned and walked away, and behind him came the sound of Ramesses weeping, raw, animal, alone. Moses kept walking, for some victories feel like funerals. 600,000 people walked out of Egypt. Men carried bundles on their backs, women balanced jars on their heads, children clutched the robes of their parents, and the elderly leaned on the young. They carried bread that had not risen. They carried everything they owned, and they carried 400 years of chains finally broken. For the first time in generations, they were not property, but freedom did not feel safe. It felt like walking off a cliff in the dark. Then the ground began to shake. Moses turned, and dust rose on the horizon like a brown wave. Then the glint of metal, then the thunder of hooves. Chariots, hundreds of them, for Ramesses had changed his mind. The people screamed, for the sea stretched before them, endless, gray, impassable, and the army closed behind, fast, armored, merciless, and they were trapped. They cried, "You let us out here to die. We should have stayed slaves." Moses faced the sea, and his staff trembled in his grip, the same cracked wood he had picked up from the dust. He closed his eyes and thought, "I am not enough. I was never enough." Then a voice, not thunder, but a whisper that filled his whole chest, "You were never supposed to be." Moses opened his eyes, and the words unlocked something. He had spent 80 years believing he needed to be enough, but God had never asked him to be enough. God had only asked him to lift the staff. He raised his staff. The wind came like a roar, and it slammed into the water and tore it apart. Walls of sea rose on either side, trembling, impossible, alive, and fish hung frozen in the deep, and the seafloor stretched before them, dry as bone. "Go now." 600,000 ran, mothers clutching babies, old men stumbling forward, and no one looked back. The last Hebrew reached the far shore. As the first chariot entered the path, Moses lowered his staff, and the walls collapsed, and the sea remembered what it was. Chariots tumbled, horses cried out and went silent, and when it was over, the water lay calm, as if nothing had happened. On the far shore, the people stood gasping, weeping, laughing, alive, free. Miriam stepped forward, the girl who had watched a basket float away 80 years ago, and she lifted a tambourine. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously." One voice joined her, then 10, then 600,000, the first free song in 400 years. Moses climbed a dune away from the celebration, for he needed to feel the weight of everything settle. Below, the people danced, and the tambourine of Miriam flashed in the firelight. Then footsteps behind him, slow, unsteady in the sand. An old woman climbed toward him, white hair glowing in the moonlight, frail and bent, and she had been climbing toward him her whole life. She said, "I never got to tell you, all those years in the palace, singing to you, watching you grow. I wanted to scream that I was your mother, but I stayed silent so you could live. And I never got to hear you call me mother." Moses took her hand, thin fingers, fragile as bird bones, and said, "I know, Mama. I think I always knew. The song every night. I never saw your face, but I heard you." She leaned into him softly, and she began to hum the lullaby from the palace. "Sleep, little one, the night is long. The river took you, but love stays strong." Moses looked at the sea, silver under the moon, where somewhere beneath that water a basket had once carried a baby toward an impossible future. She asked, "Was it worth it?" And he answered, "Yes, Mama, it was worth it." She smiled, mother and son, finally. The story of Moses teaches us profound lessons about identity, failure, and a God who does not give up on broken people. Moses ran into the desert and hid for 40 years, believing he was nobody, belonging nowhere. Yet God found him in that wilderness and called him by name. Here is the first truth. Your past does not disqualify you. Your worst failure is not the end of your story. It is often the beginning of something greater. But Moses had another problem. He stuttered, and he felt unworthy, and he stood before a burning bush and begged God to send someone else. And God did not argue with him. He simply said, "I will be with you." Here is the second truth. Your weakness is not a wall. It is a door, and it is where the strength of God walks in. And Moses was 80 years old when his purpose finally began. 80. If you think you have wasted too much time, if you think your moment has passed, it has not, and it is never too late. Jocheb teaches us the hardest lesson of all. She placed her baby in a basket and pushed him into the river, not because she did not love him, but because she loved him more than her own need to hold him. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open your hands and trust God with what you cannot control. Ramesses reminds us that pride protects nothing. He had every chance to yield, and every plague was an invitation to humble himself. But he held on tighter with each one, and in the end he lost everything he was trying to protect. Those who refuse to bend will eventually break. And Moses points forward to Jesus, the one who leads us not just out of slavery to Pharaoh, but out of slavery to fear, shame, and death itself. Your weakness is not your disqualification. It is your invitation. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it and subscribe, because that truly means the world to us. Tell us in the comments which Bible story we should tell next, and please keep us in your prayers. God bless you.